Carl Jung revealed a fundamental truth about overthinking. When we try to suppress a thought or feeling, it doesn't go away. In fact, as he argued, it often comes back stronger. When you try to push away an uncomfortable thought or ignore a feeling that bothers you, it doesn't disappear. Instead, it grows stronger and returns with more force. To understand why this happens, we need to understand Jung's view of the psyche. Jung saw the mind not as a single, unified thing, but as a collection of different parts, all trying to communicate with the conscious self. Some of these parts hold feelings you're aware of, but others contain emotions, memories, and impulses that you've pushed away because they're uncomfortable or don't fit with how you see yourself. When you have an experience during the day that triggers an emotion you don't want to feel, your conscious mind often tries to suppress it. Maybe you felt embarrassed about something you said, or guilty about a choice you made, or angry at someone but didn't express it. Your conscious mind says, "I don't want to think about this," and tries to move on. But the emotion doesn't actually go anywhere. It remains in what Jung called the unconscious, the part of your mind that exists beneath conscious awareness. Here's where overthinking begins. The unconscious doesn't stay silent when it holds unresolved feelings. It tries to bring these feelings back to consciousness through repeating thoughts. You find yourself replaying the same conversation, revisiting the same moment, worrying about the same situation. These aren't random mental events. They're the unconscious trying to get your attention, essentially saying, "There's something here that needs to be acknowledged." Jung understood that the psyche seeks wholeness. It wants all parts of you to be recognized and integrated, not split off and ignored. When you resist a part of yourself, whether it's a feeling, a fear, or an aspect of your personality, the psyche works to bring it back into awareness. This is a natural and actually healthy process, even though it feels uncomfortable. The repetitive nature of overthinking is the psyche's attempt to complete something that feels unfinished. Each time the thought returns, it's offering you another opportunity to finally face what you've been avoiding. The thought persists precisely because you're resisting it. Understanding this changes how we view overthinking. It's not a malfunction or a weakness. It's actually your psyche trying to help you become more whole by acknowledging all parts of your experience. Jung introduced a concept called the complex, which helps explain why overthinking often feels like having multiple voices arguing in your head. A complex is a cluster of thoughts, feelings, and memories that organize around a central theme. Everyone has complexes. They form throughout life based on your experiences, and they operate somewhat independently within your psyche. For example, you might have what Jung would call an inferiority complex, formed from experiences where you felt not good enough. This complex contains memories of past failures, feelings of inadequacy, and beliefs about your limitations. When something happens that activates this complex, like making a mistake in front of others, a whole network of related thoughts and feelings gets triggered. Suddenly, you're not just thinking about the current situation, you're also remembering other times you failed, feeling the same old inadequacy, and hearing an internal voice saying you're not capable. These complexes operate like semi-autonomous personalities within your psyche. Jung observed that when a complex is activated, it can temporarily take over consciousness. You might notice that you suddenly sound different, think differently, or act differently. A normally confident person might become anxious and self-doubting when their inferiority complex is activated. This is why overthinking can feel like you're not fully in control of your thoughts. Different complexes can also conflict with each other, creating the experience of internal debate. One part of you might be saying, "Everything will be fine, just relax," while another insists, "But what if something goes wrong? You need to prepare." These aren't just random thoughts. They're different complexes, each with its own perspective and agenda, trying to influence your behavior. Jung believed that becoming aware of your complexes is essential for psychological development. When you can recognize that a particular pattern of overthinking comes from a specific complex, you gain distance from it. You can observe it rather than being completely overtaken by it. Instead of thinking, "I am anxious," you might think, "My anxiety complex is activated right now." This subtle shift creates space between your core self and the complex. The goal isn't to eliminate complexes. Jung understood that's impossible and not even desirable. Complexes contain important information about your history and your needs. The goal is to develop a conscious relationship with them. When you understand that overthinking often comes from activated complexes trying to protect you based on past experiences, you can listen to what they're saying without being controlled by them. This is what Jung called making the unconscious conscious, bringing awareness to the automatic patterns running beneath your thoughts. One of Jung's most important discoveries was the shadow. The shadow is the part of yourself that contains everything you don't want to be or don't want to see about yourself. It holds traits, impulses, and characteristics that you've judged as bad, wrong, or unacceptable. Everyone has a shadow. It forms naturally as you grow up and learn what's acceptable in your family and culture. The parts of you that don't fit get pushed into the shadow. Here's where this connects to overthinking. Much of your mental rumination involves what Jung called projection. Projection happens when you take something from your shadow and unconsciously place it onto other people. You don't see it in yourself, so you see it in them instead. This creates a particular type of overthinking that focuses on what others might be thinking or how they might be judging you. Let's understand how this works. Imagine you have a harsh inner critic, a part of you that judges yourself harshly for any mistake. This critical voice might have developed from how you were treated growing up, and it's become part of your shadow because it's painful to acknowledge how harshly you treat yourself. Instead of seeing your own self-criticism, you project it outward. You imagine that other people are thinking the same critical thoughts about you. This is why you might replay a conversation, convinced that everyone noticed your mistake and is judging you harshly. You're not actually responding to what they think. You're responding to your own shadow material projected onto them. The harsh judgment you fear from others is actually the harsh judgment you direct at yourself. But because it's in your shadow, you can't see it clearly. You only see it reflected back from the imagined thoughts of others. Jung observed that we tend to project most intensely onto people and situations that somehow resonate with our shadow content. If you secretly fear you're boring, you'll be hypersensitive to any sign that others find you boring. If you judge yourself for being selfish, you'll overthink situations where you wonder if you seemed selfish to others. The external worry mirrors an internal judgment you haven't fully acknowledged. Understanding projection is psychologically liberating. When you catch yourself overthinking about what someone else thinks of you, you can ask a Jungian question: what does this tell me about how I'm judging myself? Often, the answer reveals shadow material that needs attention. The person you're worried about isn't actually the issue. They're serving as a screen onto which your shadow is being projected. When you withdraw the projection and recognize it as your own material, the overthinking often loses its power. Jung made a crucial distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is your conscious sense of who you are, your identity, the I that thinks and makes decisions. The self, with a capital S, is the totality of your psyche, including both conscious and unconscious elements. It's the entire personality, the whole person you are, much of which remains unknown to your conscious ego. Overthinking often emerges from an imbalance between ego and unconscious. Jung observed that the ego likes to believe it's in control. It wants to think it understands everything, can predict outcomes, and can manage life through rational planning. But the unconscious is vast and contains forces the ego cannot fully control or comprehend. When the ego tries to maintain too much control, refusing to acknowledge uncertainty or the unknown, the unconscious pushes back. This pushing back manifests as anxiety and overthinking. Your ego might be saying, I need to figure this out completely. I need to analyze every possibility. I need to know exactly what will happen. But the unconscious knows that life contains uncertainty, that not everything can be controlled or predicted. The tension between the ego's need for control and the unconscious reality of uncertainty creates mental loops. Jung called the process of balancing ego and unconscious individuation. This is the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are, which requires the ego to develop a humble relationship with the unconscious. The ego must learn that it doesn't have all the answers, that it can't control everything, and that some things must be left to the wisdom of the larger self. When overthinking takes hold, it's often the ego in overdrive, trying desperately to achieve certainty where none exists. You replay conversations trying to determine exactly what someone meant. You analyze future scenarios trying to predict exactly what will happen. You review past decisions trying to determine if you made the right choice. All of this represents the ego's refusal to accept limitation and uncertainty. Jung would say that the solution isn't more thinking or better analysis. It's developing what he called a religious attitude toward life, by which he meant a sense of humility and recognition that some things are beyond conscious understanding. This doesn't mean giving up rational thought. It means recognizing its limitations and developing trust in the unconscious processes that are also guiding you. When the ego relaxes its grip and accepts that it doesn't need to have everything figured out, overthinking often naturally subsides. The psyche finds balance. Conscious and unconscious work together rather than against each other. Jung developed a therapeutic technique called active imagination, which offers profound insight into the psychology of overthinking. Active imagination involves consciously engaging with unconscious content by giving it form and allowing it to express itself. This might sound abstract, but it reveals an important truth about why thoughts loop endlessly. When unconscious content remains formless and unacknowledged, it haunts consciousness through repetitive, circular thinking. The thought keeps returning because it hasn't been given proper form or attention. It's like an inner voice that keeps calling louder and louder because it hasn't been heard. Jung discovered that when you deliberately give this unconscious content a form, when you personify it or externalize it in some way, it often completes its communication and stops its repetitive demanding of attention. Here's how this relates to overthinking. Let's say you have an anxious thought that keeps repeating, "What if I fail? What if people judge me? What if I'm not good enough?" In typical overthinking, your ego tries to argue with these thoughts or suppress them. But Jung would suggest a different approach. Instead of fighting the thought, give it a form. Imagine it as a character or a voice. What would this anxious part of you look like if it were a person? What would it say if you let it speak fully? This process of personification does something psychologically important. It creates separation between your conscious ego and the unconscious content. You're no longer identified with the anxiety. Instead, you're in relationship with it. The anxiety becomes something you can observe and engage with, rather than something that overwhelms you. Jung observed that when people engaged in active imagination, allowing unconscious figures to speak and express themselves fully, these figures would often spontaneously evolve and transform. A threatening inner critic might, when fully heard, reveal itself to be a protective voice that's afraid you'll be hurt. An anxious voice might express legitimate concerns that need practical attention. Once these unconscious figures feel heard and their message is received, they often stop their insistent repetition. This explains why simply trying to stop overthinking rarely works. You're trying to suppress unconscious content that needs expression. Jung's approach suggests the opposite. Give the overthinking a form, let it speak, engage with it consciously. This doesn't mean indulging in endless rumination. It means creating a conscious container where unconscious content can express itself, be acknowledged, and then integrate back into the whole psyche. When unconscious content finds form and recognition, it stops its repetitive knocking at the door of consciousness. Jung devoted much of his life to understanding why the unconscious becomes particularly active at night. He saw dreams as the primary language of the unconscious, a symbolic communication from the deeper psyche to the conscious ego. Understanding Jung's view of dreams helps explain why overthinking intensifies when you're trying to sleep. During the day, your conscious mind is directed outward, dealing with external reality and immediate demands. The ego is active and in control. But as night approaches and external stimulation decreases, the balance shifts. The ego's grip loosens, and the unconscious has more opportunity to make itself known. This is the natural and necessary rhythm of the psyche. Dreams are the unconscious communicating through symbols rather than literal thoughts. A dream about being chased doesn't necessarily mean you're running from something in literal life. It's symbolic. It might represent avoiding an uncomfortable feeling or running from an aspect of yourself. Jung believed dreams were attempting to compensate for one-sided conscious attitudes. If your conscious mind has been too focused on control, dreams might present images of chaos or wildness, trying to restore balance. Nighttime overthinking, in Jung's framework, represents a kind of failed dream state. The unconscious is trying to communicate, trying to bring important content to awareness. But instead of doing so through symbolic dreams, it's doing so through anxious, repetitive thoughts. This often happens when the ego is too tense to fully surrender to sleep, when it's holding on too tightly to control and worry. Jung observed that unresolved psychological content naturally surfaces at night because the conditions are right for the unconscious to speak. The problem is that the conscious mind, instead of allowing this material to take symbolic form in dreams, tries to process it literally through worried thinking. You replay the conversation, analyze the situation, worry about tomorrow. These are literal, ego-driven thoughts, not the symbolic language of the unconscious. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of what he called a ritual attitude towards sleep. Before sleep, the ego needs to consciously release its hold, acknowledging that there are things it cannot solve or control. This creates space for the unconscious to do its work through dreams, rather than through anxious rumination. When you understand that nighttime overthinking represents the unconscious trying to be heard, you can respond differently. Instead of fighting the thoughts or trying to solve everything before sleep, you can acknowledge that your psyche is processing something important. You can trust that the unconscious will continue its work while you sleep, through dreams and through deeper processes that don't require conscious effort. This trust allows the ego to finally rest. So, what does this Jungian journey tell us about our own overthinking? It shows us that these looping thoughts are not a sign that we are broken, but a signal that a deeper part of our psyche is asking for attention. Whether it's an emotion we've resisted, a complex that's been activated, a shadow part we're projecting onto others, or the ego's desperate need for control, overthinking is a call for greater consciousness. It's an invitation to turn inward, not with frustration, but with curiosity. By learning to listen to these inner voices, to engage with them through tools like active imagination, and to trust the wisdom of our unconscious, we can begin to transform the painful cycle of rumination into a meaningful journey of self-discovery. The very journey Jung called individuation.